how do we instill trust in our product? How do we instill trust in our consumers, whether that be B2C or B2B customers of our product, and really rely on privacy, policy, and security to ensure that we have a solid and product that is going to have long-term market share, and it's going to be able to be a good offering for our customer base.
So let me jump in there. Randy, thank you so much for moderating for us. So I think the trust is huge, and hopefully we can drill down on trust a little bit as we move into the discussion. Maybe a few other areas I think are really important in terms of this intersection is one, workforce development. It's an area that we're focused a lot on at FIU, is making sure that we can train and educate the future workforce. There's such a disruption right now happening in just about every industry vertical out there. How do we keep a fresh supply of talent in the tech spaces? Our focus is a lot on cybersecurity, so how do we fill that gap in terms of the multi-million person shortage that we expect to see in the cybersecurity workforce? The other one that I would say, given our focus on policy and the intersection of tech and policy, is maybe some of the ethical issues around sort of the development of AI, machine learning, deep learning, that kind of stuff, and the values that are infused into the development of those systems, and how do we manage that as we roll these systems out into practice?
I think for us in cybersecurity, security solution providers, Trend Micro being one in specifically, I think it's more of an opportunity, but also a challenge for everybody, right? As digital transformation moves us from the data centers to cloud, from traditional endpoints to mobile, I think that creates different opportunities, unfortunately, for cyber criminals. So we basically have to sort of match and exceed what they're doing in this space to be able to develop those security solutions, the partnerships, in so many different ways. So I think from a changing technology perspective, I think for us, it's critical for us to be constantly innovating, right? Not only innovating from a technology perspective, but also innovating from a workforce development piece as well. So changing technology, definitely it's something that I think we all are taking advantage of personally, but also professionally, but it creates an incredible amount of risk associated with it. So our job in the security industry is to be able to help our customers manage that risk.
Yeah, so Brian brought up the ethical, right? This intersection between security and privacy, which is a very controversial topic all around the country or all around the world, right? So thinking about it from an industry perspective, both the startup businesses and the more larger corporations like Trend Micro. So Andres, you built up Axxis, right? So what are some of the considerations, particularly for small businesses or startup businesses, playing with this idea between security and privacy?
Sure, so the fundamental question becomes who's responsible? Is it the provider of the service, being the platform or the website or the application that you're using, or is it the end consumer? I think there's probably more traction in the B2B space in terms of regulation and policy. Here in the US at least, we don't see a lot of consumer education being promoted to create awareness around the risks that come with using different applications. We were just talking earlier, I've got a 6-year-old and he's always downloading different applications on my phone. And I'll be honest, I don't have time to read the privacy contracts of each of those applications. So the question becomes am I liable for that, or is the provider of that information or that game liable? And then what happens to the information that is on my phone? And that's just a very simple example for all of us that live in this wired economy. When you take that now to the business paradigm, it's what happens when I use that information? What is the purpose behind the use of that information? How can I disclose to the recipients that are going to provide me with that information of how I'm going to be leveraging that for either monetizing their information or providing a better service to them? So it really comes down to making sure that there's transparency in how the provider or the application provide the use of that data to the end consumer.
Just to add one note, also accountability, and I think you raised this right off the bat, who's responsible? I was on a panel the other day at FIBA, and someone mentioned to me, the question was, okay, so if my bank card is hacked, then the bank puts the money back in my account, no harm, no foul. But if my data is breached, who puts that back in, right? Where does the responsibility lie? And you've seen sort of, the notion of enforcement, right? I think the proposals on the table, the sort of criminal neglect, at the top of organizations because they bear the responsibility of protecting data. I mean, I think that as we continue to see this debate expand, that's the kind of discussion that we're going to see. Accountability over who manages or who owns the responsibility of protection of that data.
So coming from the large corporation, Ed, where do you sit on this? Where does Trend Micro fit in this place?
Well, we have products for consumers as well as the enterprise, right? So we try to manage that risk at the personal level, but also at the enterprise level. So I think, one of the challenges, like you said, is accountability, and then obviously responsibility. I think, with the advent of IoT or the explosive growth of IoT, I think Gartner mentioned that we'll have 26 billion connected devices by 2020. So I think what we're going to be seeing is an incredible shift that we're all going to have some level of responsibility. I think the unique difference is when you look at responsibility, cyber really throws out everything that we normally think of when it comes to who is responsible. Because I think there's other things that we mentioned before around, say, even the credit card industry from a financial perspective. Personally, yes, you're responsible, but are you really held accountable? No, not really, because the banks take that risk from you. But I think as we move forward, as we see specifically with IoT devices, these devices are increasingly being compromised and utilized in broader and bigger attacks. So will consumers ultimately be responsible for the devices that they have and securing those devices? And it's a question that's not going to be answered anytime soon, but I think the pace is picking up.
Yes. So Brian, thinking about the individual consumer, right? So we had the NICE conference. Manny Medina was one of the keynotes, and he talked about how at Cyxtera they hate humans, right? He was being a little facetious in saying he hates humans, but looking at the application, how artificial intelligence can help prevent those emails, those phishing emails, from getting to the end user. So what are some of the things do you think of outside of our AI that we can do to help the individual end user?
So, I mean, I think Manny is talking about sort of the automation, right, of addressing the cyber threat. And there's still lots to unpack there about whether or not, the infusion of AI is going to resolve cybersecurity threats going forward. But one of the things that I've talked a lot about is the infusion of culture and understanding that sort of there's a cultural aspect to this that I think, like Andres, my 5-year-old swipes every screen she sees. She thinks everything is a mobile device that she can work with. And she also watches every YouTube video out there that I have no control over, and it gets really tough, right? You're constantly watching over. And then I realized very quickly that no one was teaching my 5-year-old about sort of protecting her online footprint, right? I engaged the school, tried to find different avenues to say, well, who's teaching primary and secondary institutions cyber hygiene? As simple as cyber hygiene. She knows how to brush her teeth, but she doesn't know how to protect herself in an online digital environment. And so that's where I think sort of understanding the shift in culture that's required, right, to ensure that I think over time that there's a far more, deeper appreciation that, that we have over protecting our information, protecting ourselves and our digital footprint. And again, I think that's cultural in terms of sort of the shift in what's acceptable.
And if I may, it's definitely cultural. There was a study done last year by BCG where they looked at the different markets throughout the world, and the US, Europe, the more developed economies tend to be more privacy prone, right? So they're looking at ensuring that information is not disseminated out there. But when we look at other markets like India and China, they're more willing to expose and share their information for the better good, right? So it's more communal in nature. So there's definitely a correlation between culture, technology, and I think the policy as well. If you look at the U.S., we're probably at the forefront of it.
I mean, Andres, that's a great point, because I'm not sure policy is closing the gap between sort of the security and tech, tectonic shifts, right? And we're always finding that policy is racing to try to catch up, to undo something or fix something. And oftentimes, at least what we see at the Institute of Public Policy, is that policy is not necessarily adjoined and working, alongside tech change, right? And I think we can do a better job at that, certainly.
So thinking on the policy side, and obviously the big news last year, particularly at RSA, if you recall, was GDPR in Europe, right? The General Data Protection Regulation passed, and they're starting to find folks. Obviously, Google and Facebook were the initial targets here. But Ed, we were at Directions, we talked about this on a panel. the U.S. looking at its own version of GDPR, and what role does the private sector have in playing in that space?
I think we were just talking about this earlier. I think the unique difference is it's two sides of the same coin. I think when you look at Europe and you look at GDPR, I think ultimately Europeans believe that there is a concern about privacy associated with private companies holding their data or misusing their data. I think here in the United States, I think there is a greater acceptance for companies holding our data or using our data. We have a bigger problem with government, say, having our data. So it's a unique perspective, and obviously goes back to our history. But I think going forward, there's definitely a push. We have California pushing out new privacy regulations. I think it's going to continue to happen, but I think it's going to happen in different ways. I think what might end up happening is because I think here in the United States, we recognize that there's value associated with our data. We might not actually know about how we get things for free, so to speak, because of our data, but we get a lot of things for free because we sort of give permission and give access to our data. I think we might end up getting to a point where, from a privacy perspective, is where you might have a shift where we might have more control of our data and might have a better chance of monetizing our data, right? So having control, but having opportunities to monetize our data. But privacy is a privacy paradox. We had this discussion before. When we want better services, we want better efficiencies across the board. Ultimately, because of machine learning and AI, ultimately that you need more data, right? More good data and bad data. There's that data pipeline. And so that's the privacy paradox, is we're going to want additional, resources, services, better experiences as consumers and as within our organizations, but we're going to have to give up some of that data to have that experience get better.
Andres?
Yeah, so I was just going to chime there on Ed's comment, and it's really around, there's got to be a balance between balancing policy and innovation, right? Because if we apply too much policy to the innovation supply chain, then we don't innovate, and vice versa, right? So there's got to be some balance there to ensure that universities, startups, markets can develop without any friction, while at the same time protecting the consumer in each of those markets.
So thinking about policy in the context certainly of the United States, but what about our partners down in Latin America and the Caribbean? Brian, I know you're starting to see, obviously cybersecurity is now starting to blow up, but now artificial intelligence in the region is starting to grow in there, and our partners don't seem to be quite prepared for that. So what are some of the things that you're seeing on your end in Latin America and the Caribbean specifically?
Well, I think there's certainly a recognition that that the wave is coming, and that countries in the region need to be better prepared, not just for the integration of technology, but also the disruptive aspects of technology. I mean, automation is coming to the region in a very fast way. I mean, these are economies that that rely on skilled labor that is being displaced by automation. That has a ripple effect in the security and social spheres, political spheres. But I do see, and I work a lot in the region, I do see a sort of recognition that there's a gap there. We run a series of programs. I'm trying to shamelessly plug FIU, but we run a series of programs throughout the region that we focus on cyber leadership and strategy. We partner with the Organization of American States. There's an intentionality to doing capacity building in the region, and the region's asking for it. Latin America is asking for that skill. And so, I think there's recognition. I think we're working towards it. On the policy side, particularly in the regulatory side, some of that is still very much in the nascent stages, right? I think that there's lots of evidence to support formative changes in terms of laws and policy that begins to mitigate the challenges associated with sort of incorporating technology. But I think the region still has a ways to go. But in North America, we still have ways to go also. So I think there's some of this learning as we go in terms of the impacts of technology, and the pace of change is just really disruptive in and of itself.
Yeah, so thinking in the AI space, right, how automation is going to ultimately displace a series of workers. Right now, just in cybersecurity, we have 314,000 jobs open today in the United States. That doesn't include around the world, right? So what are we doing to help train up both the two-pronged approach? One, how can we retool those in the current workforce, that workforce sector is not going to be around in about 5 to 10 years, but also how do we do that cultural generational shift where we start training them. And you all know this from small business and private sector experiences, that you don't have 6 months, a year to train them up. You need them eyes on glass immediately. So what are some of the things that you're looking for to help train them up? We'll start with Andres and then we'll move down the line.
Sure. So the comment earlier around the talent pool, right? So when we look at academia, when we look at the producers of talent, they're being disrupted, right? So you see STEM programs at an early age. We see university programs that are now marrying computer engineering with business, with policy. So academia and education is shifting, right? And that's supplying these resources that we know there's a lack of globally. So you have markets that have been at the forefront of that technological change that are producing the talent, right? So you're gonna see folks coming in from India, China, Pakistan, Europe, Israel, into markets that don't have the talent pool, will develop the IP, and then our folks are gonna go abroad as well. So there's gonna be some interesting cross-pollination of talent and cultures. And I think that alludes to the innovation piece of the technology. The other piece is, I think there's this misconception that machine learning and AI is going to totally displace the human, right? At the end of the day, we still need experts. The role of the technologist is being redefined, right? Before, in our days, there was the MIS major and then the computer science major. I think that's totally been redefined. We've got data scientists, we've got architects, we've got now digital experts. So I'm not really afraid of the machine taking over the market. I'm really more afraid about the smart guys that are using these technologies for the lesser good than I am worried about being displaced for jobs.
Brighton, where do you sit here?
I think that's a good point. So, I mean, the one thing I would add is that I think as higher ed, we are far more closely aligned with industry than we've ever been before. And I think that was one of the things we were getting just really, really wrong, is that we were teaching things in the classroom that industry wasn't necessarily asking for. And so I think one of the things that we've done, particularly at our institution, but our partner institutions in this space, is align better with industry, right? We want to make sure that we're putting talent out that can feed the pipeline, in a fundamentally beneficial way. Because what we found is we'd have students leave the university, walk into the workforce, and then be trained on some language that was completely different from what they were learning in the classroom. And we recognized that wasn't helping sort of serve our case in tertiary education, which is workforce development. So that's one. I think we're doing that better. The other thing I think we're doing better is we're understanding that sort of there's a mix of education that's required. Right? We can't wait 4-6 years to produce talent that's going to go in the workforce because we have a need for workforce now. And so there's the tooling and there's the retooling. The tooling is making sure that we find, maybe apprenticeship programs combined with higher ed that after 2 years move students into the workforce while they're continuing to pursue a degree. There are programs that are starting at sort of secondary education. So, high school students that, because we're hearing industry say, I don't need a college degree to fill some of this job, some of this workspace. Give me a really good high school student, put them in a 2-year apprenticeship program, we'll train them, and then they can move forward. So we're in higher ed, I think, trying to reconcile some of that. So we recognize the time span to move talent into the workforce is something that we're hung up on. And I think the third thing is the retooling aspect. This is the ability to say, look, right now I think 35% of the cyber workforce has migrated from a different industry into cyber. And so how does higher ed play a role in helping do some of the retooling?
I think going back to what Brian was saying here is, especially from the private industry side and cybersecurity side as well, is I think it's quite apparent that we need to have a better pipeline, starting from K through 12 into the undergraduate and graduate areas. I mean, I think we really need to address the speed problem, right? Because arguably kids today, as they learn topics and skills or theory, and so to speak, that will change by the time they end up graduating, by the time they enter the workforce. The technology will have changed, the platforms will have changed. So the idea is really rethinking what we're doing around workforce development. And it's critical from a public-private partnership. We've been talking about public-private partnership in cybersecurity for many years around the enforcement, the operation side of the house, but I think on the education, it's going to be critical. We really need to get into this micro skill development where we are able to teach skills and then go from a truly theory-based to competency and skill-based approach where we're able to then apply and partner the right needs and requirements from an industry side to academia so we can actually train these individuals to find jobs much quicker. On the technology side, I think absolutely we need to get into this automation, we need to get into this orchestration side of the house to be able to meet. I think the challenge is I don't think we'll ever completely close that gap. We'll always have that gap because the exponential growth of technology and the innovation around it requires a lot of dynamic learners, right? So I mean, the life learner is the discussion that we have all the time is when I want to hire somebody, I'm looking at not only their aptitude to do the job, but I'm also looking to see how quickly they learn and how aggressive they are about really learning, right? So I think there's so many different layers, and I think we've covered it here. It's the technology, it's workforce development, it's the retooling of existing workers, and I think the only way you get any of that done is through a partnership.
So, Andres, you brought up the bad guys, right? So it seems like the bad guys are a lot better at us at ramping up and getting involved in the new technologies and new platforms that are coming out there. How do we keep up, particularly from a private sector perspective or even a public sector, which is filled with regulation and preventing us from fighting all that innovation that we want to get a part of? So how do we keep up with the bad guys?
Man, that's the Brian question. That's a tough one. Well, the reason they move and they move quickly is because they don't have the friction that we have on the private sector side, right? So the good guys always have friction, right? So if we kind of turn our heads and try to be a little bit more rogue about it, then we could probably compete head to head. But I think it's education. I think it's education, and I mean education of the consumer, right? We deal a lot with customer experience, and we deal a lot with marketing technologies, and really it comes down to making sure that the recipient of these applications and these tools that they're using in their day-to-day is as transparent. I keep using that word, but I don't see enough programs out in the market educating consumers, and that's where the critical mass is, right? The business consumer, that's less than 25% of the population that is using some of these applications, so there needs to be programs. I did want to comment on Ed's, his statement, and I'm, the talent pool is critical, right? And this is a plug for Miami as a whole, because out of all the cities that I travel to, I do see a very strong alignment between academia and the local industry, right? And that's Miami-Dade, that's UM, that's FIU, that's Berry. Whereas in other markets, that alignment, it's starting to be part of their model. So it's exciting for all of us here in South Florida to be able to see that we're at the forefront of all this technology innovation and policy change.
I just want to add, I don't have an answer for how to get in front of the criminals. Outside of, again, this desire for cultural change, right? I mean, if you can get individuals to stop clicking on the kiddie link, I mean, that is part of the solution, right? And this is why we talk about cultural change, this ability to ensure, that they're not responsibility or accountability, but certainly better education on the hands of the user so that we can mitigate some of those threats right off the bat. I mean, insider threats still represent, I think, the bulk of what we're seeing in terms of successful, criminal activity. And so that's it right there. I mean, stop clicking on the kiddie link, and I think it kind of helps get us there.
I think from one distinct difference is cyber criminals and working in the cyber criminal undergrounds around the globe. The one thing the advantage that they have is trust. They're able to scale trust like we cannot, right? We've been suffering a trust deficit for many years when it comes to cybersecurity, and it's no one's fault to begin with, but it's all of our responsibility to overcome it, right? So cyber criminals on a daily basis, similar to startups, it's the culture mindset of they want to be, it's a meritocracy of sorts. Cyber criminals come together and work together quite easily for the greater good of making money, right? And I think we need to do a much better job of doing that, because I think ultimately we've had a lot of barriers, be it liability, be it trust, obviously primarily trust, but other barriers that we've not broken down because of the fact of that. So cyber criminals, the reason why they succeed is because of this trust piece. So we need to be able to match that trust and go from a reactive mindset and footing and get into a proactive mindset and footing. Understand how they operate, understand what they're going after, and then be able to develop our strategies. I was watching another panel just here recently, and we were just talking about the problem with a lot of organizations. They don't have a strategy. It's very reactionary. They have a particular risk they have to mitigate. They find some type of solution, be it technical or otherwise, and then they move on. And that's the problem. So we need to be much more strategic, proactive, and trust each other.
Yeah. Well, we got about a minute to wrap up here, so I'm just going to go down the line. One final question, talking about emerging and future technologies. So if you had to think about what technology is coming out and it gives you either concern or excitement for opportunity, what would that technology be? Would it be IoT? Would it be AI, machine learning, deep learning? Would it be quantum computing? What is it for you, Andres?
All of the above. All of the above. There's so many different ways that these tools can be used in for good, right? And they're creating new business models. At the end of the day, it's how do we continue to innovate, right? So how do we get into that digital mindset of creating new products and services? And these are the widgets that we have, and they're getting bigger and better.
That's a tough question. I'm afraid to answer it. I don't want to be judged if I favor one over the other. I think, most technologies that come with sort of cost and benefit. The one that the sort of space I'm in is I'm certainly seeing the surge in deep learning. Whether we want it or we don't, it's coming, and it's coming, very, very fast. And so I'm not sure we quite grapple with sort of the impacts that this is going to have, or the benefits, frankly.
No, I think I would say, I'll answer this. The technology or the innovation that's really exciting to me is machine learning and AI. One that it's not new, because machine learning has been around for quite some time. I think it's been this convergence or confluence associated with the vast amount of data that we're collecting on a daily basis, personally, professionally. So the machine learning piece is the most exciting piece because of the fact that how quickly we can scale some of the problems or fix some of the problems using machine learning. And so I think obviously we watch Netflix on a daily basis. We watch and enjoy. We use our mapping apps. So we utilize machine learning much more than we all think we do. But I think that is going to be ultimately the type or the technology that I think that's going to help us all, because ultimately it's really not artificial intelligence. From my perspective, it's more intelligence augmentation, right? It's getting better tools for us to make the decisions, right? Data to decisions.
I just want to ask when Ed
second.
has time to watch Netflix every day.
Yeah, I don't
didn't
know.
get that.
I don't know. Well, that's all for us. Please join me in giving a round of applause for Ed, Brian, and Andres.